I'd like now to begin our substantive exploration of issues of democratic development by thinking about what is democracy? What are the different levels of democracy, the different elements of a quality democracy, and how do we distinguish between democracy and authoritarianism and different types of authoritarian regimes? So in this lecture, we'll look at the definition of electoral democracy. I'll distinguish between a higher threshold of democracy that we call liberal democracy. We'll look at the different elements of democratic quality, and then we'll briefly review different types of authoritarian regimes. So to begin, what is democracy? Well, at the most elementary level of an electoral democracy, the kind of most basic level of democracy, it's a system of government. Now we're talking in this course about government at the level of a nation state, in which people can choose their leaders and replace their leaders in regular, meaningful, free, and fair elections. In order for a regime to be a democracy, it cannot simply have elections. It can't even simply have multi-party elections. Elections must be held at regular intervals, as prescribed by the Constitution. Elections must be meaningful in the sense that they have consequences, that the people, the parties, the individuals who win the election actually have the power to rule. There can't be some hidden or reserved domain of power like the military, a powerful ruling monarchy, or some hidden authority that really exercises substantial decision-making power. Elections have to be free in terms of people being able to compete and contest for power without great inhibitions, and elections need to be fair in terms of there being a reasonably level playing field. Now, this means the ability to monitor elections in the contemporary era. It means some degree of access to the mass media, some reasonably level playing field. Let's now go on from the most minimal condition of an electoral democracy in which power is regularly open to competition on a multi-party basis through free and fair elections, to consider other elements of democracy and the higher level of what I describe as liberal or high-quality democracy. This has three elements. One, as Guillermo O'Donnell has identified them in his brilliant writing on the subject. One is democracy as popular sovereignty, democracy as what is sometimes referred to as majority rule, as emerges through free and fair elections and extensive competition for power, political participation, the ability of people to hold their government accountable at the polls and make a government responsive to the wishes of the people. But of course, this is not only majority rule, it frequently must involve minority rights as well. And some democracies are structured, as we will see in this course, to be more majoritarian than other democracies which privilege consensus. The second element is liberal government in the sense of protecting liberty, freedom, equality of all citizens, the privileging of rights of the minority, at least to have a voice and to have protection. And of course, the elevation of a liberal environment of tolerance and mutual respect, as well as individual empowerment, what we call a civic culture. And the third is republican government in the sense of good governance, responsible governance, broad-based entrenchment of the rule of law, and the ability of different agencies of government to restrain the abuse of power and hold one another accountable. So having a law-based state, an accountable state, and ineffective state all come under the rubric of good or Republican government. Now let's look at these different elements one by one. First of all, liberty. This is fairly elementary. Go to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or any of the many other human rights instruments that are now deeply embedded in regional and international practice and convention, and you will see identified a wide range of liberties that individuals have as basic human rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, the right of individuals to assemble peacefully and protest, to move about the country, both for their personal lives and work, and to campaign in different parts of the countries, freedom of thought and personal belief, including religious belief and practice, the right of groups to use their own language, identity, culture. Freedom means freedom from, as well, the unjust and arbitrary depredations of the state. Freedom from torture. The right of individuals to be secure in their homes from warrantless search and seizure. The right of individuals to have access to justice, as I'll explain under the rule of law concept, through due process. Freedom of imposition from corrupt demands and impositions by state officials who are not responsible under the law. Freedom from violence and intimidation by state and non-state actors. The second element, closely related, and these elements of liberal democracy overlap with one another, reinforce one another, interlock in a system of very high quality democracy. The rule of law, the right of citizens to be secure in their persons and be treated equally under the law, so that citizens are free from the danger of arbitrary arrest, exile, imprisonment. The secure knowledge that no one is above the law, not even the president or prime minister of a country. That government power is limited, that no official can violate the provisions of the law or the Constitution in order to exercise their power or seek undue advantage. For this to happen, the courts must be independent both in structure and in fact. All of this protects the civil liberties of citizens and, very importantly, maintains a climate of order, predictability, and limited power, limited government, rather than arbitrary and unlimited power of government, is a crucial element of liberal democracy and of, frankly, any good and just government. The rule of law involves some specific guarantees and details. Individuals have the right to know the charges against them. There is a right under any principle of the rule of law, particularly in a liberal democracy, to be presumed innocent until you are proven guilty through due process in a court of law. Many countries have democratic constitutions that affirm in principle the rights to due process and a rule of law. But if the courts in practice are overwhelmed with far more cases than they can process, then the rule of law is vitiated in practice, and it doesn't matter what the principle may provide in the law or the Constitution. We know that in many developing democracies, there is an enormous backlog of cases. In some courts in India, individuals may have to wait years or even decades for their case to be heard. And there is a powerful principle under the rule of law that justice delayed is justice denied. So individuals have a right in a liberal democracy to a reasonably fair, speedy, and public trial by an impartial court. It is a principle of the rule of law that individuals can only be held accountable for a law that was established in advance. There's no retroactive justice for a law that's introduced and then applies retrospectively to people who could not have been guided in their behavior by a law that didn't exist at the time. And the same goes for taxation. And of course, no one may be subjected under a deep principle of a rule of law to torture or cruel and inhumane punishment. A third, and again closely related principle of the rule of law is what we call horizontal accountability. The term was given us by the great Argentine political scientist, very tragically and unfortunately recently deceased, Guillermo O'Donnell. And horizontal accountability involves, again, the restraint of government power so that different agencies and branches of the government are checking and monitoring one another. Power is separated and dispersed, so we can think of this as separation of powers, checks and balances, but it's a broader concept, obviously in particular to discipline and constrain executive power, which is where power is most often concentrated and most easily abused. As I will explain in a later lecture, horizontal accountability involves independent institutions of monitoring and control of corruption and abuse of power. Not just the conventional branches of government, executive, legislature, judiciary, but some of the new institutions that have emerged to manage and constrain, check and monitor other executive and legislative and judicial branches. The Counter-Corruption Commission, an Ombudsman or Public Constraints Commission, the ability of Parliament to investigate wrongdoing, and a audit agency at the supreme level of the national system. If we're worried about checking and constraining government, having limited government and constraining the abuse of power, then we need to think specifically about some of the institutions that are most often implicated in the abuse of power. And in a democracy, one of these may be the military, the police, the intelligence apparatus, more generally the whole sector of state security, which if it is not subjected to the rule of law and the ultimate authority of democratic elected civilian authority, then it may be a problem for democracy rather than a pillar of democratic legitimacy and stability. In a democracy, the armed forces must be directed by and subordinate to civilian elected officials and their appointees. The commander-in-chief in a liberal democracy must not be the head of the military. The commander-in-chief is the elected civilian head of government, whether it's a president or a prime minister. And even below the head of the military, other top military command appointments in a liberal democracy with civilian control of the military should be made or at least approved by the civilian authorities. A deep structure of civilian control involves the budgets of the armed forces and the intelligence and state security agencies being reviewed, being understood, being approved, and ultimately set by civilian authorities with expertise or with advisors who have expertise in the executive and legislative branches. This requires building up professional civilian capacity in the defense ministry, which should be headed by a civilian, in the office of the president or the prime minister, and in parliamentary committees that begin to develop some expertise and monitoring capacity of their own. It means that armed forces and intelligence agencies cannot operate domestically for political purposes and that domestic security should be maintained by separate policing functions and security agencies that are, again, responsible to civilians, closely supervised by them, and constrained in their authority under the Constitution. It is vital in a genuine and deep liberal democracy that the entire state security sector be neutral and nonpartisan, not a tool or an instrument of a president, a prime minister, or a ruling party, that they serve the country and not the government of the day, and that they therefore be professional, depoliticized, and have a strong ethic of service to the country. These are some of the initial elements that I present of the quality of democracy.